All right, shall we begin? Okay, thanks for being here. We're going to stand for the pledge, and I would just invite you to face yourself towards the Haldane flagpole. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Do you want to call roll call, Catherine?
Yes. President Daly?
Here.
Vice President Headland?
Here.
Trustee Clements?
Here.
Trustee McNally?
Here.
Trustee Parr?
Here.
Great, thanks. First up is our next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, April 21st at 7 p.m. Right here in cyberspace. And Phil and I were also discussing the possibility of doing a executive session on that Tuesday meeting to discuss tenure. So what we do every year is we have a meeting with the administrators, the principals, and they share with us their recommendations for tenure. We usually have it with some dinner. But
we can still do that
at this time. And then the administrators leave the meeting and we speak with Dr. Benante about any non-tenured administrators that he would like to keep us abreast of. And so we were thinking we could do that as an executive session next meeting, which is next week on the 21st. And how's that sound to all of you guys? I believe the administrators have been briefed on the possibility of that. So does that work for everybody?
Yes, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That works for me.
Yeah. Peggy?
And what time would we start?
I think 6 o'clock is fine, right, Phil? Is that what
I
we
think
said would
that's
be
fine.
enough time?
Okay.
That should be fine.
Usually we do 5:30, but it's because, you know, we're eating and chit-chatting. So I think 6 o'clock would be okay.
Okay.
All right, so we'll say 6 o'clock to discuss the tenure recommendations. Thank you. The next thing to mention is that our Board of Education trustee candidate petitions are available. You can get them through our district clerk, Catherine Platt, at cplatt@haldaneschool.org. As of now, we still have no more information about how those elections are actually being conducted. So we know that they will be conducted at some point after June 1st, so that they have been delayed. We also know that no one's allowed to go out and physically petition. And that's really all we know, as far as I know. So we're just waiting on guidance to hear about any other deadlines or parameters for the Board of Education voting process. But if anybody's interested in throwing their hat in the ring, you can contact Catherine Platt. And that's all I have to say about that. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Benante for his update.
Thank you, Jen. And if it's okay, just give me one moment. I will share my screen. And Jen, if it's okay with you, we have the budget update immediately following this, and I put it all in one presentation. So if you don't mind,
just keep it rolling.
An update. We'll keep it rolling. Great. Thanks.
Sounds good.
Okay. So 1 second here. Okay. So again, good evening, everyone. And I see we have a few community members who are listening in as well. So I hope everyone enjoyed a happy Easter or Passover. And definitely a bit different for our family. And as sharing with the admins today, it's probably the first time in my life I haven't seen my Aunt Connie on Easter Sunday, and definitely missing her and her lasagna. That being said, we made the most of it, and I hope you were able to as well. I have a few updates related to COVID-19, and I'll go through these and pause if there's any questions from our trustees regarding the current status of our school's response to COVID-19, and then I'll transition into our budget discussion. So as you're aware, schools are closed through April 29th. By another update to the governor's executive order. And I've been candid with folks. I think we know and now that these closures are likely to be extended until we're well on the other side of the COVID-19 outbreak. So as I listen to Governor Cuomo's daily updates, it sounds like there's signs that we're at the apex, or perhaps just getting beyond the apex of this outbreak. And I'll remind folks that it took us about 1 month, if not even longer, maybe 6 weeks to get to this point. So it's likely to take us at least that amount of time to get to the other side of it if this were to follow a normal distribution. Now, I'm an analyst in that way, but that's just where I'm at in my thinking. And I know there's different models and whatnot, but I fully expect that schools would be closed for beyond the April 30th date right now. But I am encouraged by the fact that this very well may be the, how did Governor Cuomo's frame it the other day, the end of the beginning. And hopefully we're starting to talk now more about coming back at some point and what that looks like. Shortly after the announcement of the prolonged closure, the Board of Regents announced that the Regents exams would be canceled for this school year. We were anticipating some sort of activity along these lines, and quite frankly, it is the right thing to do considering the circumstances. So I would refer families who may be impacted by this, students who may be impacted by this, to Mrs. Sniffin's letter to families from last Friday that went out to high school students. And I believe Dr. Silky also shared that with middle school families as well, because we do have some middle schoolers who take Regents exams. And so that's where it sits. And that those communications contain important information related to the impact regarding the impact of Regents exams being canceled. We did have another community forum today. We moved it a little earlier in the week. So Danielle Pack-McCarthy from the Phillipstown Behavioral Health Hub joined me. We talked about mental health and mental health hygiene in these times when we're under quarantine and all sorts of restrictions, and definitely not living what may be our typical way of life. And Danielle was provided some great information and some tips for families, both for adults and also for kids. So I was really pleased to have Danielle as part of that call today. And that will go out to the community, the recording of that, as well as the Q&A document in the coming days. And as it relates to our continuity of instruction plan, we realized that we needed to make some decisions regarding third quarter grades. And we've articulated what those decisions are now in what we're calling a grading addendum. And Judy Barbera and Chris Salem were really essential in bringing this together. This will be distributed on Friday to families, so it's another reference document for families who may have questions about my child's grades through the third quarter and what to, or the second trimester for the elementary school, and what I can anticipate as it relates to that in the official school record. So I'll refer families to that communication, which will be distributed on Friday afternoon. And really, I would say, as far as our response, we're getting to the point now. We've kind of in dribs and drabs tried to do this a little bit over the previous 2 weeks, but I think we're at a better point now where we're transitioning to other items of business that we had on the agenda for this school year. So we'll be talking a little bit later about bringing the enrollment study to conclusion and providing a report to the board on that next week. Also, the strategic coherence plan we're bringing to closure, and we'd like to present that to the board in the following meeting. And then there's other business items that we were attending to on a day-to-day basis back in March that we put on hold, and that we're slowly now beginning to reintegrate back into our discussions, because we're not so much bringing or trying to build a continuity of learning plan any longer. We're tweaking and modifying it, and that's giving us the space and the time to attend to now, again, other items of business that we have to attend to this school year. So with that, I'll pause just to see if there's any questions from our trustees, and if not, we'll transition to the budget update.
Yeah, I have a question, which is, I think I raised it in a different context, maybe last week, which was when I was, or maybe 2 weeks ago. So time has no meaning anymore. It was when I was talking about my daughter and her experiences with different teachers teaching in different ways. I guess the question gets to how is the administration and the building administrators thinking about teacher evaluations and feedback in a time when you can't, in a different way, stop into a classroom and see how somebody's doing? And how do we even think about providing support and guidance for teachers who are doing a lot of stuff in a very new context, forced very quickly upon them? Just love any feedback off the top of your head. Realize
Sure.
this is out of the blue.
There's a short answer and then I think a longer follow-up item, John.
Okay.
And first, just the context of this, because I know I heard your question a couple of weeks ago when you asked it, and that triggered our principals are checking in weekly with parents for feedback on the continuity of learning plan.
Great.
So
Great.
that's one thing that our principals are doing deliberately to make sure that they hear these sort of things or stay attuned to what's working and what may not be working in our initial plan. And formally, they meet also with their PTA leadership. So each building has a vice president in the PTA's leadership structure. And that's the primary topic of discussion. However, our PTA was also very helpful in soliciting feedback through their own mechanisms from families, and they provided that to me late last week. And then I shared that with our administrative team today, and we're going through that, which included some of the items I think that you're mentioning here about differences in approaches or practices, and determining what's most effective for our kids. So we realized that that's something that it was difficult for us to focus on in our first 2 weeks in this process. But now, as again, we're having some space, we're not creating the plan, we're in a better position to monitor teaching and learning, no different than we would if we were in the same physical space together. So I would anticipate that you would see, or we will be monitoring this more closely in the weeks to come than we were able to in the previous few weeks. And one thing that each of our principals did, this was a really astute practice, was that they added themselves to the Google Classroom or whatever platform that each of their teachers is utilizing to facilitate learning for kids right now. So they have that ability to check in, no different than it would be, walking into a classroom if we were on campus on a day-to-day basis. So that's something we're staying attuned to now. And we've got good feedback from the PTA that's actionable, and we'll continue to monitor it in the coming weeks.
That's great, especially as it seems we're settling in for another couple of weeks of this.
Yes, and longer.
And longer. Yep. Yeah. Yep. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I imagine one of the challenges too is that it's almost like they're teaching in a vacuum to a degree, because there's not immediate feedback. You know what I mean? They can't teach something and then see how the kids are learning it right there and then and see how they're responding.
Yep.
It's like you only get so much feedback from the kids in terms of how they're digesting what you're giving them.
Right.
And each learning environment is completely different. So it's kind of hard for a teacher, I would imagine, to figure out what works and what doesn't work.
It was a really complicated issue on the front end, and some districts took different approaches on this. We had the option to try to be highly standardized on the front end, but then be placed in the position to immediately have to accommodate what may be wide disparity in readiness for what we were articulating as the standard, and how this should be facilitated. Whereas we took a different approach and said, let's let folks do what they're most comfortable with right now, and we'll try to adapt and modify and move closer towards a standardized, again, standardized is a loaded term, and I don't intend this, but gradually move towards those best practices in the weeks that come. So you would have, and you may have read about or be seeing some districts that right from the start, this was the expectation. We're going to a synchronous environment on this way. And to some extent, those districts that did that were already doing it or already had a model for doing that in many ways. The districts that went right to synchronous, again, were leaning on that structure in other ways prior to COVID. We were not. So it wouldn't have been necessarily appropriate for us to just jump right into that. But we've gradually tried to shift towards synchronous opportunities throughout the week. And we just felt that was respectful of where our teachers may be. Also just the huge discrepancy, not knowing what each of our practitioners would be managing at their own homes with their own kids. So we took a bit of a different angle in approaching this. And I think we took the right one because it didn't place this immediate stress on our teachers to have to figure out new platform, new format, while they were managing their own transition to, working from home and, getting their own kids set up. But, each week we tweak and modify. And I think those tweaks and modifications largely have been positive and noticed by our families, and will continue to do so through the extension of the closure.
Great.
Okay, so we could always circle back later on in the evening if there's any other questions, and I'll move on to some budget updates. So a lot of this is known for the board, but any community member who may be listening in, the initial budget parameters for this school year included the development of a budget up to the tax levy limit. So back in early March, when I presented the budget to the board and the administration's recommendation, that's what we had, was a budget that was developed up to the levy limit, which was 3.3%. Now, obviously, the world has changed since that time, as we've continued to talk about, and the crisis has, really caused us to reevaluate the current community sentiment or vibe, for lack of a better term, about how much we should levy. Now, one piece of information that we now have that we didn't have a couple of weeks ago is that our anticipated state aid, for the most part, has remained consistent with what we were projecting leading up to this, or through the budget development process. Now, what we don't know is how our aid may be adjusted throughout next school year. And that's somewhat of an unknown for folks, that while we factor in an aid amount and we get an initial projection in March each year, it can be adjusted throughout the start or throughout the front end of the following school year. And there's aid measurement periods. And the governor has indicated, and his aides have indicated, that the state aid we've been allocated will be reassessed on a continued basis through the start of next school year. Now, the first measurement period ends in April, so that's good. That's actually coming up. So we'll have some indication then if our aid is going to be adjusted. But there's another one in June, and then their final one is in December. So you'll notice these come in staggered increments, that increase. So the first one is 1 month later after you get your anticipated aid projection, it's assessed again. Then 2 months after that, and then a handful of months after that. So it's just something for us to stay attuned to, more so next year, because we're anticipating fiscal stress than any other, than maybe in previous years. So what I've heard and from you, and I've heard from other members of the community, and is that we want to remain that we're attuned to the fact that there's many members of the school community who are realizing unanticipated economic hardship due to this crisis. And I think I've tried to frame, I'm deliberate in how I frame these questions, in that I want to make sure I have us focused, or I'm driving this conversation to focus on the big picture items. And so the essential questions really are two: what, if any, additional reduction should be made to the administration's recommended budget for the 2021 school year? And furthermore, how can the budget process account for the current economic climate, while honoring the district's focus on strategic objectives, because there will be an end to this. And you've heard me say this before. And while between September and I'd say middle of February, we were spending a lot of time talking about our strategic objectives in some way, shape, or form, our long-term goals for kids and for student learning at Haldane. And at some point, I anticipate we're going to come back to those needs, those areas of focus that we were really developing a budget towards addressing. So those needs aren't going to go away. I envision we're going to be back in school. We're going to be back in some regular routine at some point, and those needs are going to come up again for us. And I want to make sure that we're not being so drastic and taking action with the budget development that now we have a compounding effect down the road on what our needs are, and we're in no position to address them. So that's really the emphasis of these two questions, is having one foot in where we are and one foot also in our future, and perhaps being back to where we were in some ways in the coming months. So there's a few strategies that the board can take in reducing the tax levy limit, or that the board can direct the administration to take in reducing the tax levy. And I should say the tax levy here, not the tax levy limit. So we're already at the levy limit. So again, the tax levy limit was an additional $660,000 on top of what we had levied last school year. And that was that would have been a tax levy percentage increase of 3.3%. So that's just a key figure that I want us to keep in mind here. So the most challenging options, I would say these are less than ideal, and I'll get to this, is to reduce the recommended budget right now, I would say is less than ideal. It may be necessary. You may feel that's absolutely what we should do at this moment in time. It's less than ideal in that we had spent months developing that budget through extensive dialogue with internally. And now in just a couple of weeks from a remote or in a remote distance scenario, we would now have to go back to the table and try to hit some target. And that could be complicated to do given the collaborative process that we engage in to develop the budget. Now, another option might be to make mid-year budget reductions next school year. And if we see significant changes in aid, again, based on those measurement periods that I talked about earlier, we may have to make mid-year budget reductions out of necessity. I don't think that's a strategy we want to go into the school year thinking about or having in mind, but it may be, if it does happen, it should be happening out of absolute necessity. And quite frankly, I think we want to try to avoid that at all costs. But some districts inevitably have to do that depending on shifts in state aid allocations. We're not as state aid dependent as other school districts are. If you were to look at our budget, generally we get about 9% of our budget is driven by state aid, whereas you have other districts where half of their budget's driven by state aid. So hopefully this is something we're able to avoid, even if there are significant shifts in our aid allocation throughout the year. So some more manageable options. As Ann and I worked with this, these are some ideas that we think are respectful of the board's desire to perhaps work with that levy number, but at the same time won't dramatically influence the budget we had developed or recommended to the board in early March. So as we examine our previous tax rates that are set in August, they typically reflect a 20 to 28% decrease from what we're estimating in February. So we went back, we looked, we examined these figures. We don't control how tax rates are set, and Ann can provide more detail on this, but through observation, we realized that they tend to run lower than what we are projecting when we're doing budget development in February, to the tune of, again, 20 to 28%. So this in and of itself could account for a 2/3 to almost full percent reduction from our anticipated levy by that fact alone. I had asked Ann when we recognized this, well, can we anticipate that that would happen again this year, given everything that's going on? And Ann had indicated, yeah, I think so. I don't think we don't think the variables that are influencing how tax rates are set are necessarily going to be influenced by the current crisis. Anne, am I getting that right? I think this is a good part just to invite you in case, because I know you know the detail of this much better than I do.
Yes, you have it absolutely right. And what happens is, you know, it's so almost backwards in that we're developing a budget in the spring, and then we really don't know what our assessments are until the summer. Our assessments generally increase, and anyone who has always, you know, followed tax rates knows that what we anticipate during budget development is the high mark. The assessments go up because of construction and some reassessments. Perhaps when houses sell, they get reassessed. It's called the equalization rate also changes, and I don't have that information yet either, so I'm not going to make a guess at that. So when we estimate the tax rate, when I estimate the tax rate in the spring, it's based on last year's assessments and equalization rates, which will change, but not until the summer. And
so generally what, you know, when we think about this, we levied our proposed budget last year was I think a 2.71 levy increase or somewhere around there. I'm just drawing from memory. So, you know, by this fact alone, when folks, when the tax rates were set last August, and I think what you're saying is we likely didn't realize in their tax bill an actual 2.7% increase last year. Likely it was somewhere, you know, around 2.
correct.
Yeah. Now, this is out of our control, and I want to point this out. This is a trend. This is a trend we would expect to continue in the summer, but we don't necessarily control tax. We don't control tax rates. So what is in our control is this next option. So I think, again, if history repeats itself, and again, this is a kind of a consistent theme, is that tax rates generally come in lower. But that's not in our control. What is in our control is that we have excess fund balance at the end of each school year, and we can anticipate having, you know, excess fund balance this school year. Certainly, this situation, while you know, undesirable from a financial standpoint, when we're not in regular operation on a day-to-day basis. So there are some costs we're not incurring right now. So we're going to have, you know, excess fund balance. We were going to have some anyway. We're only going to have more at the end of this school year. And that's something that the board is more familiar with because we discuss this each summer. And one option or another option is for us to take that excess fund balance or a portion of it and to apply it towards the reduction of the tax levy. And I have an illustration here that I want to just go through with you. And again, this is for illustrative purposes. This is not by any means what I'm saying we will do. It's really up to the board in the summer. We'll have recommendations for the board's consideration, but it's up to the board to agree to or question or direct the administration to go in different avenues with this. So typically we apply some of that fund balance to the school lunch deficit, and it's a deficit. So at some point we have to pay that. Generally, and I think I've talked to Ann about this, our strategy has been to pay it off when we can, so as not to continue to accrue a higher cost on the school lunch program. So we typically try to pay that off at the end of each school year. We, in the past, have applied excess fund balance to the TRS and the ERS contribution reserve. We did that last year. And we want to be mindful of that right now because our contribution rates could be impacted in future years. So when the economy's not doing well, when the market's not doing well, that impacts, districts have to make up the difference, if you will, in the teacher or employee retirement system to make that whole. So you will see fluctuations. Now there's a smoothing process that's good for us, but generally that's why we have a TRS and ERS reserve, so we don't realize you know, and our budget isn't being driven, if you will, by a rate increase or a significant rate increase in any given year. So we have the reserve set. We could apply excess fund balance to that. In some ways, that's addressing, I think, being mindful of long-term tax impact as opposed to short-term tax impact. And again, we can have that discussion in the summer. We then could also apply excess fund balance to a reserve that we could access through the 2021 fiscal year to offset some of those state aid decreases we could realize. Again, that's somewhat of an unknown. I think those measurement periods, those initial ones, the one that's occurring in April and the second one that's occurring in June, are highly relevant to that discussion that we may have in July or August. So let's see what happens through those measurement periods in April and in June. And I think we're in a good, we'll be in a much better position in July and August to decide should we even do that or not. Again, we're not as state aid dependent, so that's something we may decide just isn't necessary for our school district, but we'll have way more information down the road. Now, the illustration, let's just assume we have $300,000 at the end of this school year in excess fund balance. We might decide, and again, this is just hypothetical. We might direct $100,000 of that for the school lunch deficit, as we typically have, or whatever that amount is. We might put $100,000 in the TRS and the ERS reserve because we realize that that's being prudent long-term with when it comes to the development of the budget. And then we might want to take $100,000 and offset that tax levy, just as we've described somewhat herein. Let's look at what that would do. Well, our tax levy, and I introduced that figure, was around $660,000 at 3.3%. If we took $100,000 off of that, well, our tax levy is now $560,000 roughly. And that brings our net rate increase down to 2.2%. That's just by applying $100,000 in fund balance. That's not include, when combined, if you will, I'm sorry, also with our anticipated tax rate adjustment, that 20 to 28% adjustment. I'm sorry, I should have clarified that. So that can go a long way. Those two factors, again, one of which is directly in our control, one of which is not, but we anticipate occurring to some extent. Now, really, the board could decide come summer, instead of $100,000, we want to do $150,000, or we want to do $200,000. We haven't closed the books yet. The excess fund balance over the last 4 years has ranged from a low of $250,000 to a high of $800,000. So it could be a significant amount of money at that point that could be directed towards offsetting the tax levy for our community. So we would recommend, to us, the safest thing to do, again, while having 1 foot in our current climate and crisis and 1 foot mindful of our long-term strategic objectives for student learning, is to move forward with the initial budget recommendation. But at the same time, we'll have much better information to assess the fiscal climate in July. We'll have those 2 rate adjustment periods will be known at that point. We'll know what our excess fund balance is. And then we'll have a better opportunity to also see if there's any other external factors in the state's fiscal climate at that point to determine how to best utilize that unallocated fund balance. So normally we wouldn't be talking at that time about returning some of that to offset the levy, but we fully, would understand and anticipate that that's the direction we may be entering into in part now come summertime. So we would say hold with where we are, because we know we're not sacrificing program by doing that with what we recommended, but at the same time, re-strategizing what we do at the end of the school year when we'll have much more information than we have right now. So just to give you, again, just another way to look at this. Margaret, I think you had asked for this information, so
Thank you.
Yeah, and this is very helpful, and we have another tool to utilize as well, which I'll come out of the presentation at one point to share with you. But if you were to look at the market value of your home, so the easiest way for us to do this, because everybody's home market value is different, is to use a multiplier of $100,000, and then depending on what the tax rate increase is along the left-hand column here, this is going to be the dollar increase per $100,000 of market value. So if we're at 3.3%, if we're at the bottom, the max tax rate increase here, and my home is assessed at $500,000. Well, $56.13 times 5 would be, somewhere in the neighborhood of $280. So this just allows any community member or board member for that matter to look at what these tax increases could range from. It can range from 0 all the way up to 3.3. And then what would the impact be on the taxes I'm paying as a homeowner myself, or for my, for a homeowner, depending on how many scenarios you want to go through there. So this is a tool, or I should say, this is a reference chart that we're, putting out there for both the board's reference and for community use. Now, something else I want to show you, and I'm going to come out of the presentation here. I'm just going to go into my budget development folder, and, Ann Dinio continues to work her Excel magic here. Just get up here. So this is a spreadsheet. And again, it's I have a bunch of things on my screen because I'm trying to look at all of you in one corner and, and pull this up. But this chart at the top here, if I'll just use my cursor to circle around it, this is what you just saw. So it's just taking this chart and putting it in reference into our presentation. But if we look here and scroll down a little bit, Anne came up with a calculator depending on what that market value of your home is, and then what your taxes would be at each of those percentage labels. So you wouldn't have to do the math anymore. So I put a market value in here of $400,000. Let's assume my home is assessed, or the market value, excuse me, of my home is $400,000. Here's what my tax increase would be at each of the percentages we had listed, and we went in 0.5% increments here. So at 3.3%, it would be a $224 increase. If we wanted to get that down to 2%, which again, in our model, again, our illustration, which was hypothetical, we were getting close to that. My taxes would be about $136 increase to what I'm currently paying. Now, let's just say I had a different home market value here, and my home is valued at $500,000. You just click that in, and then the chart will adjust itself. So you can, we're going to get this on the website so folks can play with it. If it's not there already, it will be, so individuals can go in. But what we want to illustrate, and I referenced this, and I wasn't trying to be, I'm trying to be, obviously respectful of the current climate, but getting from 3.3%, again, I'm using $500,000 home value here, down to 2%, because I hear a lot of districts trying to get down to that 2% figure. It's a difference of $100 on a home whose market value is at this rate. It'll be less than that the lower the value of your home, market value of your home. So as I said a couple of weeks ago, it's not the difference between, making the mortgage payment in any given month. It is symbolic, I think, largely, and that is understood. And I think that and I understand the board's position on this, and the strategy to get at that is one that we can take. I would err on doing it when we have more information right now, as opposed to less information. So this is just a calculator that Ann created that can be really helpful in seeing what the actual impact would be to tax dollars, to what folks are paying in taxes year over year.
Can I just ask for a clarification?
Yeah,
So
please.
the difference between the market value, because Phillipstown is not assessed at 100% market value. It's not, right?
I'd have
Correct.
to.
It is not at 100% market value.
So someone's house at $400,000 market value is not necessarily going to be assessed the same as their next door neighbor who might be $400,000, right? So
I factored the equalization rate into the calculator.
You did, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So it doesn't matter that the assessment, so you factored in the assessment, so this is an easier way for someone to figure that out rather than going and figuring out that their house is assessed at whatever it is.
Right. This
87%.
calculator takes the market value and equalizes it to 100%. So if you just go a little bit farther up on the page, So over to the right where it says
Got it. I see
equalized
it.
rate, it's $17.01 per thousand, but actually it was like $37 per thousand for Phillipstown because of the fact that it wasn't equalized. So this equalizes the assessment to the market value.
Got it. So this is a pretty real number for people.
Yes, as close as I can get it based on the current numbers that we have.
Got it. Thank you. And it's that much for the year.
It's for the year, correct?
Right.
Yeah, those are important numbers to see.
Yep.
Thank you for doing that,
No problem.
both of you and too.
You're welcome.
So
Excel genius.
ahead, John.
I definitely have a couple
I
questions.
think he's not quite done though.
No.
Oh,
With
just
the-
one
I'm sorry. Go.
next step. So I can
Let him
indulge
finish.
in.
Oh, okay.
The last part, I would encourage us that we're off the regular calendar. So this is just the last piece I want to mention. And again, sorry, John, for
That's
interjecting.
okay. No, I apologize for jumping in.
But I want the board to have this in mind, is that we're off the budget calendar we create and we distribute and we really honor through the process. That's kind of out the window. That is out the window. Now, that being said, there's only so many days left in the school year, and there's only so much time we have, I think, where we have a bit of a captive audience to promote the budget to the school community and inform them of what's in the budget, what's not in the budget, what the impact is, tax rate calculators, all of that, and to present that. So the longer we wait, the less time we have to communicate what are some unique variables in this year's budget development process and whatever the board may want to do with it. So that's largely left to the administration to go forward with that communication plan. So I'm really encouraging the board to adopt a budget to present to the community for vote by May 5th. Now, we may not be required to. There's nothing in the law yet or an executive order indicating we have to do it by that date. But I would encourage us to, because that gives us about a month to 6 weeks, if you will, to when we can, I think, soon to which we can anticipate the soonest budget vote potentially being. To get it out there and to get good information out there to our community. So it gives us a couple of weeks here, but just let's keep in mind in our schedule, we have a meeting next week. And then we have the May 5th meeting. So that's going to come up. It's only 2 meetings away. So really any questions we need to resolve or back and forth needs to happen between tonight and next week's meeting. So we know what we're putting before the board on May 5th. Okay. I'll step back at this point. John, I know you had a question. I'm sure there's a couple others as well. Thanks for your attention to this.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I do have a couple questions, and I apologize. I took random notes, so they may come sort of sporadically. But I'll start with the ones that I actually wrote in an email because that's in front of me, and I'll ask. So if you can go back a couple slides to the typical decrease of the 20 to 25%. Which was super interesting to me because I don't think I'd become aware of it before and hadn't paid attention. So I know that there's a difference between the tax rate and the amount of money that we're collecting from the community. And I just want to make sure that I understand this correctly. What this first bullet is saying is that the tax rate typically decreases from February to August. But however, the money that we say that we're going to collect from the community is consistent. Is that a correct statement? Okay.
And
So I'm
looking
seeing
at you
nodding.
for affirmation on the rate piece. The money we collect, I know, is the same, but and the rate, that sounds accurate, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And so I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So, and I think you alluded to a little bit of this in your explanation, which was one of the potential reasons that may happen is that assessments on houses go up as they get sold over time. And by the time between February and when the tax rate is determined in August, the collective value of the taxable real estate in Phillipstown has increased. But probably on individual properties that got sold for more and that one went up. So what has happened is that individuals who had stayed in the same house are going to pay a little bit less, but the people who sold their house at the top of the market and the assessment went up, that potential person may pay a little bit more. But in total, we're still collecting the $16 million that we said we're going to collect in February. Is that roughly right?
Yes.
Okay. Do we feel that this year housing prices are going to continue to increase and assessments are going to go up that would lead to this consistent or projected some sort of decrease, realizing that it's not in our control?
I have not had any indication from the assessor's office or from any of the many meetings that I've been attending that this is a fear. I don't know for sure because the equalization rates aren't out, but I think that a lot of people who are watching these trends that I've been in the meetings with, it's not been even addressed.
Not clear. Yeah, I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens to housing prices and sales over the course of the next X months. Because as I would think about it is if I sit in my house between February and August and somebody else sold their house for a lot more, they're going to end up paying a little, new owner of that house is going to end up paying a little bit more tax. So my tax rate is going to come down. The school's still collecting $16 million. It'll be interesting to see, and I would suspect that we may not see as many sales at an increased price over the course of this year to drive my personal, if I sit in my house for those 8 months, rate and the amount that I might pay down. The school at the end of the day will still collect the $60 million, but that's a hypothesis that we'll have to see play out.
Right. And that's why we're trying to be clear here, John, that this is outside of our control. It's an observation. It's relevant because it's held for quite a bit of time, but it's not, we can't, I would say we're not banking on it, but it's relevant to the conversation we're having today.
And it's relevant to individuals who are currently in the community who would potentially see new entrants of the community pay slightly higher tax rates, and the current members of the community would pay slightly lower. But it's not relevant actually to the school because the school is still planning to collect the same amount of money in a total dollar aggregate. It's just the percentage for an individual. Is that right?
Yep.
The rate is across the board. But if your assessment goes up, then your taxes will go up because of the multiplier.
Correct. Yeah, right. Okay. So my second question was, we talked a little bit about this last time, which was, are we reliving 2008? And is the stock market going to crash and are we going to get jammed on pension contributions and we're going to have to borrow to do that? And I think the answer was we feel that's why we have a reserve and we're feeling good about that. And I realized that, and as you caveated nicely, which was these are hypothetical ways that we would use a potential budget excess, not specific ways.
Correct.
But I was wondering whether that was a tell or an indication of where you might want to think, or whether there's any new news, or whether that's just good, prudent planning.
Both. I think it's prudent planning, and it's those are the areas that not only us, but many districts look to now to fund reserves at the end of the school year, because those are where you can really incur significant costs based on previous dynamics that districts have encountered, and the TRS ERS one is a significant one. So it's not a tell as much as it's not uncommon for that to be the first place we would look to say, because it's long-term, that's being fiscally responsible too.
Absolutely. Is it running roughly 10% at this point?
Yeah, I think Anna was just under 10, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Okay. And that's on the entire salary base or just teacher?
It's on anyone who's in the teacher retirement system, but that also includes administrators and teaching assistants.
Okay. Got it. All right. And my last question was sort of a procedural one, which is if we, setting aside the percent tax, and if we say we're going to levy at for the maximum amount in this 1 year, I'm just going to use 60 million. I know it's not the exact number, but
It's 20, but it's fine.
All right, I'm totally off. It's 20. We levy at 20 million. At the end of, we get to the end of the school year, we have excess balance of, you mentioned over the past couple of years, it's been anywhere from 250 to 800. The incremental levy that we will have to assess for this year is $650,000. So we increase the levy $650,000. That establishes our new floor. We get to the end of the budget cycle. We have $650,000 that's excess. We set aside some in lunch. We set aside some in, right? We have money left over. If we give that money back to the community, that our new tax floor is still at 20. Is that correct?
No, I think this was something that, no, so it's not.
Okay.
It's at whatever
Okay.
we end up taking off of it will be the floor. So we either establish, so I was using $100,000
Yeah.
just for sake of argument here. So let's say we take that $100,000 off.
Yeah.
That's now the floor. So the question, and this is again why we're, that's a key distinction.
That's a key point. That's a
Yep.
key point.
Do we, so, when Ann and I were talking about this, I said, well, why don't we just take the $100,000 off now? Why wait till August? She said, well, because right now you're kind of shooting in the dark. You don't know if that's going to do it or not. You don't know what the impact of that's going to be. When you're in August, if you decide to do that, at least you know what the impact's going to be. You're not sacrificing program or other elements of your operation, but that will become your base. So that's something that we have to be mindful of going into the following year's budget development, that whatever we reduce the levy by this summer, you've now reduced your base. So you've done it. There's no avoiding that. So that has implications.
Yeah.
Because now we're starting from that point in next year's budget development that we'll never get that money back.
Right.
So if you were to push Ms. Dinio, if you were to get her in a corner and get her to commit, she'll say,
I wouldn't
"Don't-
recommend pushing.
Yeah, don't
No,
do it
I
first
would
of
not.
all, because it's not pretty. But if you really push her on it, she'll say, this is why we don't recommend reducing the levy, because it's dollars that we don't know in the future if we'll need. But that being said, we get it. There are times when you don't levy to the full amount, and we are at a point likely where this is one of those circumstances, that is just, so significant in nature that, this is likely the year to do it.
So I totally hear you. I just want to be super duper clear, which is that if we vote to adopt a budget at 3.3 at the plus $659,000, so increment the levy dollars go up from 20 million to 2659. And then at the end of the, Anne's laughing at me, so I can see you now. If at the end of the year, we turn over a rock and find $650,000 that we're not doing anything, we say, hey, we have the highest and best use of this $659,000 is to give it back to the community. We have now reset our tax base exactly where we are now. Is that a correct statement?
Correct.
Ew. Okay. Thank you.
That's why you're allowed to go up to this certain amount without a supermajority, because just because for future planning, it's considered reasonable in that big formula. And I know that this year is that higher levy limit because of the building aid that was lost. But it's just that I think, and this is just my opinion, that it would be prudent to put the money where it would be helpful in the future, because in times like this, it's hard and to just look at 1 year when you're planning, because we know that this is going to impact future years. If you're going to think about, you want to go back and talk a little bit about 2008, the gap elimination adjustment lasted 6 years, not 1. And so the we all heard recently the governor say that he doesn't have 2 nickels to rub together, and we're still experiencing more of a deficit. So if we're not, there's just a certain amount too in the federal the last relief plan. There's stipulations in there that they can only reduce next year's state aid by a certain amount. But if there's still a big hole for the state to fill, are we going to look into future again? Are we going to have the pandemic adjustment for a couple of years to come instead of the gap elimination adjustment? So if you blow all your excess money that you got because of the pandemic, because we have less expenditures this year, then what do you do in 21, 22?
Yeah.
So, those are just some ideas that I want to share with you because of what we went through in 2008, where at that point we really had very sparse reserves. We had practically none. And over the years, where the board funds the reserves over the summer, is in anticipation of what's coming down the pike. For the last few years, we funded capital reserve because we knew that we were going to want to save for a referendum. In 1 year, we funded for the EBLAR, which is the benefits, because we had some large retirements coming up. So we knew we would need money in that area. And then, so now going forward, there could be other reserves for the board to consider for planning. So it's multi-year planning.
I appreciate that. And I apologize to the rest of the board. I realize that other people may have questions. I have just one more technical question and then I'll be done. That insight on the interaction of returning excess fund balances and the resetting of our base tax levy is extremely helpful and useful. And I think how we think, because I was thinking about this as a 2-step decision process. One was decide on the budget now and then decide on the excess later as a first budget long-term, excess short-term, but it's not. They're both long-term decisions if the excess therefore impacts your future baseline. So it makes it much more complicated. So I'll ask just a very technical question. I realize we used to have or we still do, I don't think it is funded anymore. We used to have a reserve specifically for tax remediation, for tax increase remediation. So would I understand that at any point in a year, if the act of the board was to return excess budget funds to the community in some way, that would similarly reset our tax levy? So we're saying at the end of the year, we end up with $659,000 under a rock. We return it to the community. That resets our tax levy back to 0. So in December, we find $650,000 under a rock. We decided in December to return it to community. Does that reset our tax levy for next year similarly?
For the following year, right? Because once the taxes are levied and the tax bills go out and we collect them, it's unlikely that we would send everyone a refund check for that year. It would be used the following year.
So
and yes, it does. Right. The beginning, the first entry in the tax levy limit calculation is the prior year levy. So it's always your starting point.
Yep. And then you're going to net out anything that's been returned, which in this case, we're talking about the money we find under a rock.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. Thank you very much. I think I'm done.
Okay.
Thank you for asking those questions, John.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean it. That
Yes.
last piece was actually really important.
Yes. Thank you. That was on my mind. I appreciate it.
Other questions? John gave them all. He got
Sorry.
them
Oh,
before.
I have a question.
Yeah, okay.
So I know that it's been super busy and stressful for teachers in the administration to, adjust and adapt to, what was really a very radical and quite sudden change. I'm wondering if, Dr. Benante, you or any of the administrators have begun to think about and I think this is an important question, at least for me, for this conversation, what some of the additional stressors and needs might be of our students going into the 2020-21 school year, and sort of what resources and I'm sure this is like, really not at the forefront of your mind, but like what resources we might need to draw on to address both the academic and the social emotional needs of children when they come back to school. I mean, and as well, I also think it's important for us to acknowledge that, I mean, who knows what's going to happen, but that if we go back to school in September, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to stay in school for the whole year.
Correct.
So I'm just curious.
Yeah. So Peggy brings up a really good question, and it's one that we're spending probably more time now thinking about, Peggy,
Fantastic.
than what we had been in the previous weeks, because we were trying to lift this digital learning plan off the ground. But what do you realize when you get that plan in place? One, there's a digital divide, right? So one family or student's ability to access these resources is very different from another family down the road for a variety of reasons. And in some ways, it exacerbates some of the other issues that you realize on a day-to-day basis in the school due to social economic factors that are influencing student readiness or student achievement in the school are now perpetuated through this new format. So we're starting to hear more concerns about specific students or specific families that, maybe if there was a scale, during the regular school year, if we had the scale of, 0 to 10 in terms of our concern for those kids being maybe at a 6 or a 7, are now at an 8 or a 9. So ultimately, and then on the other side, you realize, how much families, in particular families in need, lean on our school for consistency, for support, things that don't even have anything to do with, reading, writing, and mathematics, just are more social and emotional in nature, more psychological in nature. And so, yeah, we're starting to see it and have more concerns, and obviously our focus is on the immediate need of supporting those students and their families right now. But we're going to, transition to what's this now look like when we get back? What is that support? What support systems are going to need to be in place? So we haven't defined that quite yet. That'll be a project in the next week or two. So once we get the grading addendum done, now what's the transition plan back look like? And I know some of our admins are listening in, so I don't want to get ahead of them, but it's definitely on our mind in an anticipated need that we have to account for. I would point though towards Peggy, because I probably spent more time independently thinking of this than we've had a chance to process it as a team. While there are going to be needs, coordinating our support for those needs is going to be integral. which would lead me towards some of what we've already budgeted for needing to stay in place. So, you know, I know, like, for example, a directorship right now, we may say, well, what about, you know, hiring a reading teacher or another intervention specialist in lieu of that, because we're going to anticipate this need. And I would say, well, we need to assess what the need is, and we need someone who can work with our staff on determining what is that assessment going to look like, and then how are we going to coordinate supports both internally and other community-based agencies to support those families if these needs are pronounced. So I would guide us towards still that extra set of hands on a leadership level become even more important. Judy Barbera from BOCES has been so integral in the background these last few weeks in helping facilitate some of this teaching and learning work. That person, you know, whether it's Judy or somebody else, whoever that may be for next school year, again, we don't know when we're going to be back, is integral in working with our teachers and our other administrators to coordinating that support on the teaching and learning end in particular.
Thank you.
But I agree with Peggy. I think, yes, Phil, all of this, you know, we have to think about, but we need to be sure there's some thought of how much money are we going to need to do those things? Are we going to need one-on-one for, you know, devices for everybody? Are we going to need another tech person? Are we going to need, you know, for long term, we've got to make sure that we've adjusted somewhere to make sure that there's money for that. Because these kids are going to need, I mean, yes, there could be social emotional issues that we might need more help with a school psychologist, or, you know, all of those things could really happen.
They could. I understand. And, you know, in an ideal world where we have this kind of money aside in a bank for those unanticipated needs. And to some extent we do. We have the unallocated fund balance. We have 4% that we carry, that if we're in a real pinch, part of that is there. So it's not that we don't have other, you know, resources that we could lean on. But again, I would encourage us, I think if there's something we've been up against over the last few weeks, it's all driving on a planning and coordination angle. And, you know, I want to make sure, again, having one foot in the current reality and one foot in our future, that we are well established on a planning and coordination lens or footing. And you know, something for Haldane, and you've heard me say this before, is that when everybody is responsible for something, nobody is responsible for it. I'm really encouraging the board and you know, and I've encouraged our school community to think about that, having dedicated individuals who are responsible for specific program elements is a good thing for our school district, or will be a good thing for our school district. And on the teaching and learning end, having you know, someone who's full-time in that end and allowing that to be their exclusive area of focus puts us in a better position to respond to those needs when they present.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, you know, and it's interesting, you know, Margaret brought up the issue of all the components that could potentially go into the puzzle that that you and the administrators, you know, decide that, you know, I don't know, maybe the puzzle, but all the components that need to go into the foundation of supporting students as they make this transition out of this, you know, this time that's really stressful for them and stressful for their families, and so then also more stressful for them, you know, in different ways. Yeah, so I think to some extent, actually, I maybe had been thinking about these components, but you know, when we arrive back and, you know, when the kids come back in September, we're not really going to know the extent of those needs and the diversity of those needs. And so your point about needing to have somebody responsible for I can't remember if I'm using the exact words, but, you know, coordination, oversight, supervision, like having that person be in place is going to be really important because, yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
I think the one of the things that's occurred over the last few weeks, it puts everything that's best about your school district, it puts everything under a microscope. So the things that are best about your school system are standing out right now. And I think that there's been some great, I'll use as an example, some great points of connection between our students and families and our educators. That there's been some great points of connection that have been made over the last few weeks. Likewise, there's been some great points of connection between our building principals and other members of our leadership team and families. But it also puts some of your weaknesses under, or areas of vulnerability, to put it maybe more mildly, under a microscope as well. And just as an example, a week ago, we had multiple families who were impacted by this virus. And obviously, you know, some families, you know, very sadly dealing with the worst end of it and having a family member pass away. But multiple families who, you know, mom's sick or dad's sick or mom and dad are sick, you know, and our principals are working closely with our support staff to support those families, to make sure that everything's in place for those to make sure those families have what they need, to make sure those kids have what they need, no different than we would do during the regular school year. You know, that's the great thing about Haldane. But imagine this, we're trying to also simultaneously build a teaching and learning plan while that's going on. I can't think to ask my principals right now, or our principals right now, to focus not only on the support you're providing to those families, but also prioritize our continuity of learning plan while you're at it. Like, oh my gosh, like, so that's where, you know, again, Judy's there. Some of our other administrators, you know, are able to provide a level of support for that. But, you know, for years, we've operated under this mindset that our principals are simultaneously responsible for both. And at some point, that reaches a tipping point. You're only able to do so much in managing your building and managing the needs of your families and your staff and all that comes with that. And at the same time, prioritize big picture teaching and learning in your district. You need a dedicated individual for that. And I think that's, you know, that's something that's come to light even more. And I realize I'm more attuned to that behind the scenes with the admins right now, because that's all we're doing is coordinating. But, you know, that dynamic, I just can't imagine having asked them to try to simultaneously, they worked on it. Believe me, they were involved, but it wasn't their exclusive focus. You know, their exclusive focus was where it should be. It's on what's going on in their building, or I should say, with their staff, with their families, and making sure that that plan that's being created is landing well, and that our kids have the supports that they need, you know, to meet whatever you know, instruction is being provided to them at that time, but also making sure that our families have the support they need to manage their health and well-being. In the way that we do. So I think it's brought some of that under, you know, a magnifying glass. Again, the very best, but also some areas of vulnerability. And we're lucky that the board supported that BOCES support through Judy this school year, because Judy's been just a key player now, you know, in the background and tying some of this work together for us as we're, you know, facilitating teaching and learning in a different way. And we may need to facilitate teaching and learning in a different way in the fall or in June. So all the more reason to have that level of support in place.
Right. Thanks for that elaboration. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you guys for this presentation. I feel like it was really helpful to, I felt like the slide deck that you guys, Phil and Ann, shared with us was very insightful into your thought process. And that was really helpful, I think, for me at least.
Okay.
And I want to share that I've been reflecting on what a lot of my board colleagues shared last meeting. I've been thinking a lot about just like our initial kind of stream of consciousness conversation that was completely indirect and not helpful probably at all. But things that came out of that, some things that I've been thinking about. Sean, I thought when you said, you know, we don't want to do something that's just symbolic. We want to do something that's meaningful. although of course symbolism can be meaningful. But you were talking about, you know, the dollars and cents of it. And I felt like that was a really, that was an important thing to think about. And I also thought that Peggy's comments about looking towards what we need to do for our kids when they come back, as she repeated tonight, are really important things. And I've been thinking a lot about those comments, and I've been thinking a lot about the flexibility that I wish that we had. I feel like I felt stress about this. I feel like there's a big decision to make for the board. Like, do we go to the max tax levy limit? Do we not? And I feel like a lot of stress with that because we're operating with so many unknowns. And I feel like as soon as we make a decision, then we're just locked into it, and we're making decisions kind of in a vacuum, you know, without knowing what to expect. And so that's all to say, not that we're making any sort of decisions tonight, but I've started really feeling like if we don't continue on our path to go to the full tax levy limit, to go to the 3.3%, then we're not going to have any options in August, when we actually look at the official tax rate. We have options then. Yes, the options might not be great options, but at least they're options. We can then say, okay, this is the reality. Do we want to give the money back? Do we not? Do we have something else better to do with it? And we have the option at that point. If we don't go up to the max levy limit now, then we have no options. And so for me, having a little bit more flexibility feels a little bit more prudent. And whether we stay on the path with a curriculum director, whether we shift paths depending on what the future holds, I don't know those answers, and I don't think anybody does, but I personally feel like we're better positioned if we have the money to do what we need to do when we figure out what that is. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. I'm feeling like we want to try to stay as flexible as possible. And if we don't go up to the max levy limit, we lose our flexibility.
I mean, one of the things I was really struck by in the whole meeting last week, not just the, you know, not necessarily the conversation about the budget, was, you know, that the town board had come to the district to sort of, you know, and had made this donation to the district so that we could distribute the gift cards to families in need. And I felt like it just was such a statement that actually really builds on what Dr. Benante was just talking about in terms of what the building principles focus has been on, you know, that the school district, you know, that the school leaders really do know so intimately the needs of their, you know, of the children and the families, you know, that are in their buildings. And, you know, just, you know, we all talk a lot about just how important and how central Haldane is to the community. And I'm repeating a little bit about what I said, you know, last week, but, you know, I do think that what's come out of, you know, this strategic coherence planning process, I mean, especially if you looked at like all the hundreds of responses, you know, that folks put into the different surveys, that not just the expectations, but what folks want from the school district really goes beyond, way beyond the most basic, you know, academic outcomes. And I don't expect that that's changed. And I mean, I'll even hazard to say that, you know, I definitely appreciate and don't disagree with the fact that there are, you know, there's some number of families in our community that might be particularly at need. But, you know, I'd be willing to hazard a guess that a lot of students, you know, could come back with different kinds of challenges, you know, that maybe they didn't have before. Like just, there's going to just be, kids aren't there's just no way that most of our kids have made the same kind of progress in learning at home as great a job as all the families are doing, right? As hard as everybody's working, it's just not the same as being in a classroom with a professional educator, and so I just think that there's going to be a lot to do. So anyway, I also really appreciate the presentation, and I the thoughtfulness, the possibilities, but I support the administration's recommendation, as hard as that is, to under these circumstances. As difficult as that might be for some folks to hear under those circumstances, I still think it's really important.
Yeah, I feel like the presentation addressed just about every question that we brought up last week in a really, I think, clear and succinct way. And I especially appreciate John's picking apart some of the finer points, which were also on my mind, which can clarify some points even more. And I also support the recommendation. And I appreciate, Jen, you're characterizing it as flexibility, because I do feel like it is largely undetermined what will happen between now and August. And if we're in the position in which we want to provide relief, we still have we have the ability to do so. So.
Yeah, for me.
Do we know? Go ahead, John.
Okay, I was going to say I'm breaking it down into two buckets. One is sort of where we need to invest, and the second is where we have risks. And I think setting aside strategic coherence plan, I think Peggy's comments about remediation in the fall, I think are significant. And I think everyone talks about the next year in elementary school or the next year middle school being that much harder. We're losing, for all good intents and purposes, everybody's losing a couple months. And so that's going to be really challenging, and frankly, teacher training and a bunch of stuff. So there's a remediation investment that we're going to need to make. And then the state budget risk, I think, is a significant one. I'm sort of really interested to see what happens, because I can't imagine sales tax or tourism or anything rebounds in the same way when we're all not doing anything for 3 months. I bought a new car.
Speak for yourself, John. I'm running to the beach. I'm running there.
Let me put it this way. I bought a new car probably the week before we went into quarantine because my last old one died. I have yet to fill it up with gas. It's getting out, like it's my commuting car. I haven't been commuting. So like there's a significant budget hit, and I don't know how that's going to pan out for New York State. And I realize that we only get about 9% of, but like, I don't know what about that. I don't know what about pension contributions. So those are the risks I think we need to be able to flexibly plan for. And I also want to be able to plan for parents of students who are in kindergarten, whose kids are going to be here for 13 years. And if we don't do the right thing now, in 5 years, they're still going to be living with the fact that we didn't do the right thing now. So that's everything that's in my mind.
So we are kind of doing this in a vacuum. There's so many ifs and things we don't know. It is really hard to kind of make a choice. Do we know what any other school districts are doing? Do you have a sense of where other school districts are going?
I do. Mostly those in the PNW region. And I think that one thing I would encourage us to consider, because there will be some figures, it'll be in a newspaper inevitably, is to look at the size of the district as it relates to what they did with their tax levy. So I'm going to tell you that most are reducing their levy, in some way, shape, or form, some dramatically. But the community climate varies significantly across the 18 component districts in the PNW region, just as my primary area of focus. So, some are, just for in some way, shape, or form, this is just one part of a multi-year discussion that, may have been had about reducing, the tax levy. So, I think every community is a little different, but most are reducing. There's a few who aren't, for a variety of reasons, though. Some, we may not be reducing for the reasons we discussed here tonight. I know, like my colleague Joe at Hen HUD, they just have, with Indian Point shutting down, they're in a totally different, environment. And their, I think, tax levy is something around 5% or something. And
I think it's more like 10%.
Yeah,
or
they had to work
something.
to get it down to like 5. He was
Yeah.
talking about. So, so like there's so many community variables, and when you get into commercial tax impact versus residential
Right.
tax impact, that influence that. But if I were to make an observation, and I'd encourage you to as well, look at the size of the district against what they're going out with, because it is known the smaller you are, the more difficult it is, or the more direct impact making a reduction has on students, on program in your building. And I'm a guy, this about me, and I try not to talk about it anymore. Reducing our, if I was in a previous district where we had a $220 million budget, it would not be difficult to reduce it by 1% and have no impact on kids, and have no impact on strategic objectives. We've done it. I've done it. Here it's difficult because you only have so much money. And I know it's a lot, $24 million or $25 million is a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, compared to what some other districts have at their disposal in terms of total volume of funds, it's more complicated the smaller you are. So it's nothing against my colleagues. It's just it's a different budget development dynamic.
So you can't even compare because everybody's in their own vacuum.
Yeah, and comparisons are going to be made, Margaret. So you ask a really good question, because it's going to happen. It'll be in the journal news at some point, and attention will be drawn to it. But I would really draw, it's apples and oranges to some extent when you're budgeting for again, in a smaller district versus budgeting in a larger district. And but most, to answer your question, I think most seem to be trying to make some sort of reduction. It's symbolic in nature. I think that they have, it's similar tax calculator that we have, that it's not going to equate to a lot of money, but symbolically feeling that's important. And I'd like to say that we are unique, though, I think, in that, because I've talked to my colleagues about this, by trying to wait until the summer to make the adjustment there. So I think they're in, it's different points where some folks are looking to make the adjustment now. And we're looking to make the adjustment a little bit later when we have some more information. And those other districts won't make an adjustment then. They're going to try to do it now. So.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as a reminder, our next meeting, April 21st, which is just a week from now, that's when Dr. Benante would like, I think, a definitive answer from the board about how the budget's looking, because on May 5th, the board will be tasked with adopting the budget in an official vote kind of way. Is that accurate, Phil?
Yes.
Yeah. So if there's any questions between now and our next meeting that you want to flush out, I would encourage you to think it through, send your emails or make phone calls to Dr. Benante and ask your questions, so that on April 21st, we can be a bit definitive. A bit definitive.
Hopefully very. But.
Like that hedge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions for Dr. Benante or Anne regarding the budget?
Just gratitude. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, Phil, get your screen off my
Yeah,
screen. I
sorry.
can't find the agenda. All right. It's communication from the public time. So here in our cyberspace, what that means is you can chat with us and we will address your chat questions or comments during our second communication from the public time. So if anybody would like to share anything with us, please do so via chat. Our information reports, they are here for everybody's reading. And we're going to go into consent agenda minutes. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
These are the minutes from our March 31st meeting. Any questions or comments? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Consent agenda financial. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Any questions or comments?
I have a question for Anne, of course. So Anne, remind me, what does it mean to be encumbered and what does it mean to be available?
Okay, so you have an original appropriation in a budget code.
Yeah,
All right, that's the original amount that we budget we're going to spend.
yeah,
Then there's another line of expensed. And then there is the column for encumbrance, and those are purchase orders that are outstanding. We have encumbered the money and set it aside with the intent to spend it. So we've committed those funds in some way, whether it's payroll, whether it's a benefit, whether it's a purchase order to buy materials and supplies or a service. So if you take your appropriated amount and subtract the expenditures and minus the encumbrances of what you intend to spend, you're left with an available amount.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Question was, one of the reasons I asked was I noticed that there are a lot of pieces in salary that are available. Is that because we have an expectation that we will not be spending them this year, or because of a different issue? Because I think if I remember correctly, there are some times when we end up paying salaries all at once. There's a timing issue on some periodically.
There is a timing issue. What gets encumbered through the payroll, which it's not a perfect system. The contractual salaries are encumbered.
Okay.
If there are any stipends, or there are any coaching salaries, or are there any extra payments above that, or if there are timesheet salaries that go against those codes, there's not a way to encumber those at this time.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Consent agenda personnel. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
moved. Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
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 We're going into our unfinished business. So strategic coherence planning is our first topic. Dr. Benante, would you like to update us?
Sure. Just as I mentioned on the front end of the meeting, that we're bringing closure to our strategic coherence plan review with the members of the coherence planning team. And I have slated, not for next meeting, but the meeting thereafter, so that'll be May 5th, a presentation being provided to the board regarding the coherence plan. And then ideally, assuming any questions have been resolved, at that point, at the following board meeting, an anticipated agenda item for the board to adopt the coherence plan for the future. Yeah, so that's it on the coherence plan. So just some things to come on that in that regard. And then more pertinent is the enrollment study. So we have been reviewing the enrollment study. There were some modifications that needed to be made over the last week or so, but we received the final draft of it today. So we would like to organize having Western Suffolk BOCES Barbara Graziano, who is the lead author or researcher on the study, present to the board at our next meeting next week during my comment period. So we will send the enrollment study to you ahead of time. I didn't want to inundate you with things today, so I'll include it likely tomorrow or the next day. It is comprehensive, so I would ask that you please review at least the executive summary, and then there's all sorts. You can go down the rabbit hole if you want, and Barbara will be available at our next meeting to answer any questions that you may have, and similar to the coherence plan. So again, the timing of these is relevant. We'll put this on the following meeting, which will be the May 5th meeting for this one, for board adoption or resolution accepting its findings, because that becomes a pretty important historical, or I should say, reference artifact in our planning for the future. So we look forward to sharing the results of that with you. And keep in mind, the enrollment study also included a space utilization study as well. So both of those are included.
And Dr. Benante, you'll also be discussing if there's any budget implications that you see as part of both of those studies.
Correct.
Yeah.
I will.
Thank you. And our capital referendum 2019 update?
So right now, just no update on that. The one thing I will say is that we do not yet anticipate, because of the outbreak, we do not, as of today, anticipate that it will influence, or it has influenced, any scheduled work to occur on our campus this summer. So that's where we stand as of today. That's not to say, next week I wouldn't have a different answer for you, but just given the information we have as of right now, we anticipate being able to proceed with that work. As I mentioned, some of the getting back to some of the regular business that was occurring, the facilities group and is something that a group that we want to re-engage to the extent that we can right now. Our committee, our Buildings and Grounds Committee, if possible, so we can continue to move forward with the work that was associated, and the review of the work that was associated with the 2019 capital referendum.
Great. Okay, going into new business. So the approval of our CSE, CPSE placement recommendations. Ms. Platt?
Be it resolved that upon the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, the Board of Education hereby approves the recommendations of the Committees on Special Education and Preschool Special Education as presented.
May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Any questions or discussion?
Can I ask a question? So usually we just put these right through. Since the situation is currently different, these are still being assessed. These kids are still getting what they need. They're still, so it's the same kind of recommendations, but they're being extended in the environment that we're in.
Yeah. So our PPS department is fully operational. So we're facilitating reviews, and we're doing CSE meetings remotely, and thus that may lead to recommendations being made and now and obviously in the future.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, approval of the school calendar revision.
Whereas in response to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Governor of the State of New York has called upon each public school district to assure that for the period commencing on April 1st, 2020 through April 14th, 2020, all weekdays shall be designated as student instructional days. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the board hereby modifies the adopted 2019-2020 school district calendar by establishing May 21st as an additional instructional day.
May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Dr. Benante, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah. So we left this day off last meeting. So that's the short end of it. The difficulty, it doesn't read well, and we're working with, and that's nothing to do with Catherine or anybody else who worked on the agenda. We're working with legal guidance that didn't quite acknowledge the break or the governor's executive order, but we know we're required to be in session on this day in May. But the governor's executive order was all related to April, that initial 2-week stint. So
Right.
the bottom line is we're supposed to be in session on this day, and we weren't really sure how to best phrase the the resolution. And this should have been on last week's resolution, so or last meeting's resolution. So that's where we stand as of today. I do think we'll come back to calendar questions and you know, in the coming weeks.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. The supplemental memorandum of agreement, Ms. Platt.
Be it resolved that upon the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, the Board of Education hereby approves the supplemental memorandum of agreement between the Haldane Board of Education and the Civil Service Employees Association dated April 14th, 2020, related to the payment of hourly employees during the COVID-19 pandemic between April 15th, 2020 and April 29th, 2020, and authorizes the superintendent to sign the agreement on behalf of the district.
May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
So this is our re-upping of paying our part-time employees. This would be, we've already done that for 4 weeks. This would be setting it up to do it for a total of 6 weeks. Does anyone have any questions or comments about it?
This extends through the end of April.
This extends through the end of April, so through our school closure, but as we've all kind of started to accept that our closure will probably be longer than that. So, you know, the board needs to decide, we can keep doing this every 2 weeks. The board needs to, you know, start making decisions though. Is it continuing? Is it something we want to continue doing? Do we think it's the right thing to do? We certainly have money. We've budgeted the money for it. The money's there. We are paying people who are not currently working. So we're paying kind of like we're doing an unemployment line. So we have to consider as a board if we want to keep doing that, if we feel like it's the right thing to do fiscally, and also for our school community, or if there is at some point, is there a threshold where we feel like we've done it enough and now it's time to not do it. So we don't have to decide that right now. We have to decide right now if we want to extend it for 2 weeks. But, you know, this will keep coming up. So we need, I think, to, as a board,
From a logistical standpoint, by doing this, are we preventing them from getting unemployment?
yes.
Yeah, so Margaret, if I may, Ann and I have talked about this, and we realize we're putting it before the board, but I think we're also going to reassess this moving forward because considering some of the unemployment, the modifications to the unemployment benefits that have been made, I don't know how necessary it is moving beyond this one. So it'll give us a little more time to connect with our employees and perhaps guide them towards another opportunity or avenue, and ease or put us in a better position, I think, as well, financially.
Because they may actually be better off filing for unemployment than getting this. However, like Peggy said last week, it's hard to come by bus drivers. It's hard to come by cleaners. We don't want them to go find jobs elsewhere and then be caught without them. Yeah,
I think the unique thing with that is the market. It's a good point, but I don't think the market is such right now that I don't know how concerned we have to be about them leaving. It is a fair point. And I think there's a couple things here. The board has, and the school district has done its part, I think, in bridging this gap. Were they to, you know, unanticipatedly encounter financial hardship. And I think we may have a role here to help play in facilitating or making known to these individuals what their other benefits may be. And then my hope would be, you know, if we do those two things well, which we know we've done one of them, and facilitate this next part well, that, you know, folks who are working for us will continue to have a desire to work for us when we come back into session.
Are some of them still helping with food delivery?
I don't think our part-timers are in. I think we've managed that with our full-time staff.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
And you know how restaurants are getting incentives to hold on to their employees and keep them on payroll? Are school districts getting a similar kind of deal that's in the works for part-time employees?
It's a good question. I don't believe we're eligible for those.
We're not eligible for that. We're not a
We're
small
not.
business. No.
No, so ours are different.
Right.
The unemployment benefits have really expanded right now in this crisis. I think they're calling them pandemic benefits or something like that. So, I mean, it might be a drag to have to apply for unemployment. You know, it's a process. I don't know if there's a wait time to get paid, but I do understand that the parameters for unemployment are significantly expanded right now. So if people needed to do that, that's something that is available for them to do.
Yep.
But we can discuss that as we go, just kind of bringing it up as something that we need to keep in mind. But this at the moment is just for the extension of their salary through the end of April. Are there any more questions? All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Going into our policy review. This is our first reading. So the process here is that the first reading is literally just that. It's a first reading. It's not really, we don't have to pull it apart. We don't have to really go into it too much. It's there just for our, to start our conversation. And then there'll be a second reading whenever we're ready for that. And at that point, we can vote to adopt it or ask for some more corrections to it or changes to it or not. So the first reading is just to put it out there.
We should explain why we're bringing this policy when we said we're reviewing.
Yeah, go for it, Megan.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Although I also see that we probably need to, this is the first reading, but it also does need some customization. Also, I think it's still pending some of the customization. So New York State, actually, Catherine sent an email a few weeks ago that I think had as the subject line something having to do with services for students with disabilities, but also attached to that email was this really great PDF sort of providing an overview of recent legislation that New York State passed regarding student and staff data privacy, which it's a complicated law, and you can see that this is a really long policy. Part of the law requires that the district have a policy related to privacy and data security by July 1st. So adopting the whole full audited policy manual will not happen by July 1st. So it's important that we pull this policy out and review it. And so I guess if I had thought about it, I would have made sure that everybody had that PDF that I know I emailed Phil about, sort of highlighting that I thought it was such a good, for me, it was such a good summary of what this law needs to do, and I had to become familiar with it for something having to do with work. So basically, that's what this is. One of the things that's in the policy, and this is where I do think that where we need where I think it needs customization, is we can either it's a lot of oversight, and I think that's involved. And so the highlighted parts of the policy indicate that, you know, we have the option of, if we were like a really big district, like a Yonkers or Rochester or Albany, like we might hire somebody to really oversee this whole process. But where just so you know why part of it is highlighted, there is also the opportunity for us to hire a third party service to do this. So anyway, that's a little bit about what's in here. I want to make sure folks get this handy dandy cheat sheet for understanding sort of what's covered by it. And yeah, what did I say? That's why we're reviewing it now. That's what some of the highlighting needs to be addressed. And I want to make sure everybody has the handy dandy cheat sheet from the state. Oh, actually, it's not from the state. It's from Rick 1.
Peggy, do you want to be in charge of sending that out to the board?
Yeah, I can find that.
Could you do that? Yeah.
Yep.
That'd be great.
Yep.
Is this completely replacing something, Peggy, or is it brand new?
Actually, I should know that. I actually do. It is. I don't have my cheat sheet. I think it is replacing something.
I don't think the policy it replaces, though, is the same name.
Yeah, hold on one sec. Give me 1 sec.
Oh, well, in the interim, I have a question. Since we're discussing, okay, there we're back.
Right back.
Were you going to sing us a song or something, Sean?
I set my my
little interlude.
676. Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I feel like, Phil, do you know?
Not off the top
I can't
of my head.
remember if it's replacing something or not. I feel like it is, but I can't remember.
That, just if I can speak to that just for a second. So when we manage the policy adoption process, so it's on for a first reading now, and then we would first ask the board to adopt the policy, and we can discuss whether that should happen next week or on the May 5th meeting, because this policy is extensive. We wouldn't delete the policies that it replaces until this one has been fully adopted by the board. So it shouldn't interfere with the next series of actions that are to occur by the board, because we wouldn't move to policy deletion until this one was adopted.
It's a brand new policy. It's not replacing anything.
It's brand new. It's not replacing anything. So we don't have anything in place now.
Not because the district was negligent, but because there hasn't been a need for this kind of policy until recently, right? Like,
it's a new law.
It's a new law.
So when we're reading it, we don't have to go back to something else and see these are the changes.
Right.
That's really exactly what I'm getting at. No. Okay.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, it's interesting. It feels like before we got this, I had actually started to think about this. I mean, I even had a conversation, I think, with Phil, like, wow, like there's all these, I mean, and it's something I encounter in my work. There are all these different vendors and all these different folks who have ed tech apps. And I mean, I think the issue of student privacy and staff, I mean, it's really important because it's not just student data. It's also, teacher and principal data. It's really making sure that the district has in place a policy to protect the privacy and security of everyone's data. So yeah,
and that's something that the current remote learning process, I think, is brought up loud and clear, right? Not just for students, but Zoom conferencing, is it safe?
Right. Yeah. So I think, I think the law, and actually New York's law, it's pretty, I mean, I don't know every data privacy law for every state in the, in the United States, but it's pretty ambitious and comprehensive. So that's, I mean, as evidenced by the fact that there's a 14-page policy.
Yeah, and when I was reading through it, that's the thing. Like, I feel like there's bits and pieces of this that we have policies for, but is this intended to kind of be comprehensive? And this is going to be policy 5676, and people are going to refer to it as the 14-page policy 5676.
It'll go down in history.
Well, it's not the longest policy, I don't think, but yeah, it's on the longer end.
It definitely is.
But yeah, so that's what's going on with it.
Great, thanks, Peggy. So we're going into communication from the public. Phil, do you have any people chatting with us that you would like?
There's a chat. Am I the only one who can see the chat?
No, I can see it.
I can see it.
So do you want me to read in the chat, or should Catherine?
So yeah, maybe Catherine, should you say who the speaker is or the chatter is? And sounds good. Share their chat with us.
Okay, just trying to, okay. It's from Andrea McHugh. It reads, I think it is important to acknowledge that our teachers and service providers were given this Herculean task with very little prep time and have gone above and beyond consistently for our students, both academically and emotionally, every single day with flexibility and grace. I would hope as you look to the future, you remember that the teachers are doing what we always do, connecting with our kids and supporting them daily.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess we can't really communicate with Andrea,
No,
so we
I
wouldn't be
think Andrea can
breaking.
hear us, but
We wouldn't be
yeah.
breaking protocol to dialogue. I'll just say thanks for the comment, Andrea, and I can very confidently speak on behalf of the board to say that we are all very thankful for the teachers and staff and administration and Dr. Benante and the community. I think everybody's really pulling together beautifully, and it's admirable. So thank you. All right, was that our only chat? Okay, going into board reflections. Does anybody have anything interesting to share?
I just want to say, so before, early on in this meeting, when I completely disappeared.
Oh yeah, I thought it was, I couldn't see you, but
I was gone.
You were gone, oh.
So Zoom decided to do an update during the meeting. I was completely knocked out. If you saw Catherine going back and forth and looking down, she and I were going back and forth on our phones. I'm going, I'm lost. And then I went back and I was like, can you see me? And she said, no, you're an attendee. You're not a panelist. So during this whole thing, I was there. And between Megan and Catherine, everybody got me back up to place, which is why when I reappeared, I looked like Megan Shields. If you notice,
you were Megan Shields for a moment.
for a short moment. But I think that all goes to say how everyone is adapting accordingly. And it's not an easy task. And sometimes technology just sends us some blips. But everybody just stepped up and made it happen. And you guys had no idea what happened. It was all fixed in the background. And I think there's a lot of that going on.
Mm-hmm.
So we appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed you were gone, Margaret, and I was concerned, but I was assuming that you were
I
figuring
was
it
checking
out.
my phone. I'm like, she's not texting
I know,
me.
I kept,
She must be
I
there,
was
and I just
too.
can't see her.
Well, I could hear you and I showed up as an attendee.
Okay.
So, and that's why Megan had to let me back in because I had to go back in as a panelist. So, and we didn't want to interrupt. Catherine's texting me going, should I interrupt Phil? I was like, no, I think we're okay.
I didn't even notice. Thank you. Sorry, I missed that.
So I was here, but thank you for everyone for adjusting, because I'm sure that's the smallest blip of things that have happened with all the teachers, all the parents, all the kids, all the Zoom meetings. But it's there and we'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that it's been very fluid, and I know at least at the elementary school level, a whole new sort of plan was rolled out this week, and all of us losing power on day one.
Oh my God.
That transition,
Worst thing ever.
The greatest, but in a way, something like that happening is a great leveler. And I think that when you're worried, you're in high anticipation about what this is going to bring, and something just gets in the way and blows up the whole plan. That's a way of giving everyone an opportunity to take a breath together and realize we're all trying to solve this problem together. And last night, right before I went to bed, I checked my email. It had to be after 10 o'clock. And lo and behold, there was an email from, my son's teacher, making it very clear to me that it was still on her mind. And I felt like we were partners in it at that moment. And I was very grateful for it, because I know that we are all working above and beyond to make sure that everyone in one way or another has the information they need to make this as accessible as possible. I'm very grateful. Right.
Nice.
So to build on the theme of changing circumstances and reconsidering things, a few weeks ago, it might have been the last time we were together, No, maybe the time before that we were together in person. I announced, so it's my seat that's up for election this year on the board, and I announced very confidently that I was not going to run because I was going to be traveling for work and I had family commitments, and those things haven't necessarily changed. Although I think my work being in schools is certainly a little bit in flux. But I think that in this time of real challenge and at least transition right now, and I think even transition back into the school year, and I actually anticipate ongoing transitions. I don't think the COVID-19 pandemic is going to resolve itself necessarily by August or September. I think it's, I mean, not to toot my horn too much, but I think that the district can benefit from having an experienced board member return to the board, if that's what the community wants. I've always said, I think I said this to Sean when it took me a year to sort of figure out what I was doing. And then at the end of the second year, I thought I was kind of getting a hang of it. It was really at the end of my third year that I felt like I really understood what it meant to be a board member. And while I know that you all are great colleagues and that the district and, you know, Dr. Benante would really, you know, support a new board member, and there may be somebody out there that really wants to do this, but even being said, I really do think it's in the district's best interest to have, you know, we work well together. I think we're I think it's a strong board, and I've decided to run again. There, long build up. So yes, I am running again. I plan to. I mean, I don't know what to do to run because we don't know how to get our petition signed, and I don't know when the election is, and I don't know anything like that. But I do, because I believe it is in the best interest of the district to have someone with my expertise and my experience to be on the board. I really do believe it's in the best interest of the district. That's why I'm running again. So.
Thank you, Peggy.
So anyway, that was a long thing, but I was changing my mind, so I had to be clear. The other thing I just want to remind folks about, and Dr. Benante, I want to check and make sure this still makes sense for you, is the timeline for the superintendent evaluation is that you would have. Okay. Do you want something else to do? Is for you to have your written materials to us by the 21st. And then on the 5th, by the 5th, all the board members, we would come together having completed the evaluation tool. And we typically go through these together, although I noticed that John did something smart, I thought, which was to collect them in advance. Like when we did the board self-evaluation, I think collect them in advance. I'll be honest with you, I can't imagine that I'm going to have a lot of time. Work is crazy for me. A lot of time to like go through everybody's self-evaluation forms and put something nice together to bring to the May 5th meeting. But I think I actually would like to have, if people would bring their tools and send them to me, their completed super evaluation tools, they would bring them to the meeting on May 5th. And would send them to me that day, so I have paper. I have them in my hand as we're going through it together. I would appreciate that. So that's one little change. Don't just bring it to the May 5th, but bring it to the May 5th meeting and send it to me in advance of the meeting. And that also means, Jen, you look worried. No. And that also means.
I'm just trying to keep track of it. So May 5th. You
Yeah.
want the materials, but you want them before May 5th.
No, I want them on the day of the meeting. I want them before that day that we meet. I don't want them well in advance. John did something where he had folks send them days in advance, and then he went through them and pulled the information together and created like a draft to review as a board. That I am not going to do, but I would like to have access to them in my hand on May 5th when we're meeting in executive session.
So you want them sent to you on May 5th by, say, 5 p.m.
Perfect.
so that when we go into executive session, say at 6 p.m., you've got all the materials.
Yeah, I'm not having to write things down and remember what people are saying. I have it there.
Yeah. Okay.
And so we'll definitely need to have an executive session before. We've never finished in an hour, so I anticipate that we'll have to go into executive session after the meeting as well. But I think doing it that way works fine.
So should we do them now or wait until we get Phil's stuff?
We decided, I mean, you can do it now if you want, but the decision that we made as a board was that we were not going to meet and discuss until we had Phil's material in hand.
Right. So I guess the question is, are we still putting this on Phil to make this happen by next week?
I've started to work on it, and I'm going to
Yes.
organize it similarly as last year, where I'll put it all in a Google folder by domain, and then I'll just share that with you.
Right.
I know last year, if I remember correctly, it may have required some explaining. So I'll try to, in whatever email I send out, just, here's how I formatted it for your reference. So ideally it makes some sense as you open it all up.
I remember it being pretty accessible. I mean, I don't think the board has ever been super stringent about the timeline. So if Phil wanted to relax the timeline,
okay.
then that's something.
It's not going to get any more or less
Easier.
busy in my mind. So I'm going to try to meet the deadline. And we were upfront at the beginning of the year, so it's fine. You'll have it by the 21st. And thanks for the extension of flexibility. I just want to be wary. I don't think it's going to be any less busy.
Well, I mean, if something huge were to happen this week, I mean,
the
board is
I
on.
understand. I understand. Nope, I know.
The board's like not going to feel bad about it.
I know I have that option, so thank you so much.
Good. That's it.
So two things.
There's more.
That's okay. Really quickly, that reminds me I need to get everybody a calendar for board self-evaluation, which I will do next time, so we don't need to worry about it now. And I also want to give a big shout out to Catherine Platt, who probably did not expect that she was getting into this when she said she'd do this. So, hey, congratulations and thank you. You've been phenomenal.
Thank you, Catherine. All right, Dr. Benante, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Just one, I'm Andrea's comment is resonating with me, and I think I may have inadvertently at talking about administrative needs and appreciations. While my intention was not to acknowledge everybody, I certainly want to make the point that our teachers have done an outstanding job. And the two highlights of my kids' remote learning experience has been when their teachers have reached out to them. For my younger son, his teacher has a little Google session with the whole class each week, and he has his tomorrow, and he's looking forward to that, despite what he'll say. We know he's really looking forward to that. And my older son, who's in middle school, his math teacher had reached out to him the other day, and I was really happy because, and I think those interactions, while my kids are not at Haldane, those are not unique to their experience. That is the norm in many cases in our school district, because it's undergirded by a value for connections between our teachers and our kids and their families. And that has continued in many ways. And I just want to acknowledge that, my appreciation for that over the last 4 weeks, and what's been just an incredible situation to adapt to. And as you know, my wife is a teacher, and just like our educators here in Haldane, has had to adapt to an incredible circumstance. And I see that I'm living that in part with her. and still just, connecting with kids, at whatever hours. And I know that's not, that's not just about my family as much as I know that's something that our 80 or so classroom teachers and another handful of related service providers and practitioners are all managing as they manage the needs of their own kids and their own families. And so I just wanted to say that in closing. And in addition to that, I'm looking forward. I think we're at a point that Peggy is right. I think we're going to be dealing with this for a long time, but I hope that the takeaway continues to be, the importance of our connection with one another. And as we're doing our best virtually here, I think a lot of folks are coming to appreciate the time they're able to share in each other's physical presence. And I know I am, and I look forward to the return to that. And this will end. There's going to be lingering effects, I agree, as Peggy said, and we got to plan for those. But I am really looking forward to the return to our staff and our staff and our students to campus some point in the future. And it gives me a great sense of hope amidst all of this. So those are all my remarks for tonight, Jen. Thanks.
Okay, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Good night, everybody.
Good
Good night.
night.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
you.